So let's jump right into it, Andri. Welcome to that little update call. I can add that. I can tag that episode onto my under the hood series that I've been trying to launch. I don't have a lot of time, but essentially just looking at more physiological data, Moxy, VO2, Lactate, and others. So I think that's probably a good opportunity to do that together. I had already looked over that data with Amélie, the physiologist at MotionLab. We did it in French, but I think it's always worthwhile doing it in English and with your expert eye on the Moxy data too. So I'm just going to jump right into it. And so for those watching, to give a little bit of context, I went to MotionLab, which is a training center, testing center in Lausanne, Switzerland. And I was able to use their altitude chamber to do a few tests with the Moxy. And so we came out with some interesting data. Andri, maybe as an intro for yourself, how much Moxy data collection have you been able to do and see over the years at altitude?
At altitude, so some for sure. I've done a bunch at altitude here in Switzerland, different people. So when we talk about altitude in Switzerland, I'm talking like 1,800 meters up to maybe 2,500. That's work I did personally. I've done stuff in chambers as well.
Okay.
And then a lot of looking at data from other people that sent me from higher altitudes as well, and obviously studies and stuff. So I've some experience with that directly, and a bunch from literature or third-person data that people send me that I talk about.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. So there was two sides or two steps to the experiment. The first one, let me see if I can move our faces a little bit here. The first one was part one was essentially 4 minutes of work interspersed with 1 minute of rest, and in each different intensity domain. And those are my values. So 150 watts was in the moderate domain, 225 middle of the heavy, and then 300 a little bit above second threshold. And I did that sequence both outside. Here on the picture, I'm outside the altitude chamber, and then when we went inside the altitude chamber, I think she set it to 3,100 meters. And then for part two, we did some repeat sprints, 20 seconds all out, 40 seconds off. And I had already done that exact sequence on the exact same bike at home. So I had the Moxy data on that. And so we just replicated that in the altitude chamber. Before we look at the data, Andrew, is there anything that sticks out or that's worth mentioning here on the, whether it's the Moxy placements, the way we set up the little experiment? The goal was really just, Amélie was just curious to see how the Moxy would show up in a hypoxic environment. So that was really the main target. But if you have anything to add before we go into the slides.
The only thing, so I like your data. It's pretty fun. And we'll see, I mean, the data responds pretty nice, as I would expect, as literature would say, as my own experience would say. So that's good. We got the response we wanted, that the Moxy is working and yours is working, and that working is kind of a weird thing, but there's a signal, there's a there that's happening, which is what we would expect. So that's nice. It's fun having all the different placements that you get to look at. We'll talk about some other placements that are obviously interesting as well. At least that's experimented with in the literature that I've experimented with. But it's a nice data set. So
all right,
it's good fun.
So let's jump into it. If I can click on here. Yeah. So just to illustrate that on the 3 intensity domains, 4 minutes of continuous work at a given wattage, and then 1 minute of passive rest, and moving on to the next one. So I guess the heart rate, and I guess I have like you saw, Andrea, I have multiple graphs on all this, so we can stop and discuss any of those at length. This is just the heart rate response. So I just used NX for normoxia and HX for hypoxia. I don't know if that's actually the right letters to use from a technical standpoint, but that way everybody knows where we're at. So obviously an elevated heart rate response in the hypoxic environment. Can we describe what this is usually due to in those environments, Andri?
Yeah, so this is pretty typical for hypoxia. So you have to think about when you go to hypoxic environments. So if you're creating that artificially, if you're going to altitude, maybe something to talk about later is like hypobaric hypoxia and normal baric hypoxia. Right.
Okay.
So is it happening because so when you go to altitude, you still have the same percentage of oxygen, the pressure drops, so you have like less molecules because they spread out further because there's less pressure.
Yeah.
Whereas you can also create hypoxia by actually decreasing the percentage. Instead of having 21%, you have 15%. So those are different ways you can generate hypoxia, which seem to have an effect as well physiologically. It's not actually the same. Okay. It seems to be that way. But basically what's happening in hypoxia is like you're having this challenge to your O2 delivery system, okay, because of the availability of oxygen from the environment. And so in order to kind of maintain normal function, because your body doesn't want this challenge or needs to somehow address this challenge, it has some mechanisms that it can regulate. And generally there are cardiopulmonary mechanisms that it's going to regulate because you're having a pulmonary diffusion problem, right? Because it's the oxygen from the outside getting in that's creating the problem. And this goes down the whole oxygen cascade all the way down to your muscles, which we see with the NIRS data. The pulmonary cardiopulmonary factors that kind of get upregulated to address this challenge are, for example, heart rate, which you see here, right? So you just, I'm getting less oxygen in, so let's just move more blood around quicker to try to bring oxygen to where it's needed. Heart rate goes up, but also all these pulmonary factors, respiration rate goes up, ventilation goes up to kind of address this problem.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's look at the next one. So here I have maybe worth noting, and we've seen that on other data sets that I've sent you in the past. There's a clear difference between my right and my left leg. So here is both in normoxic conditions. Blue is my right, and then pink is my left. So already here, there's a little bit of separation in terms of the different dynamics. What I see just overall is that in the moderate intensity domain, the positive slope of my right leg is a little bit more positive than the left leg that is almost flat. And the heavy intensity domain, my right leg is flat, and my right leg is flat. My left leg is pulling down a little bit, and then there is that separation in the red area in the severe intensity domain, that little separation between the two. And when I had sent you my data previously to look at some slopes, the zero slope between left and right leg was separated by about 20 watts, if I remember correctly. I think it was 160 on the left and 180 on the right. And my lactate threshold 1 falls kind of right in that ballpark of 170, 175. So all of those seem to validate those numbers. But off the bat, what do you see here, Andri?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take your word for all those. Now I don't remember those values of those tests. So, but yeah, so there's you get the biggest separation in the heavy, right? And in the severe, it seems to balance itself out again, which happens actually quite often, which is interesting. It probably just you kind of reach a limit, and if both are able to, then they both kind of reach that limit. In the heavy, what's interesting is they do end up, at least in this picture, visually, they seem to both then eventually balance out.
Yeah, right? I would agree. Yeah.
Even you're right at the end, kind of the end, whatever that is, minute and a half, 2 minutes or something like that. It kind of, it finds its groove and it generates that separation. And that seems to be consistent. The separation isn't like huge, right? It's not like these 20% gaps, but it's consistent with you. At least, I mean, you would know this, but you would know your data better, but it seems to be pretty consistent that separation does exist. So maybe there is some difference there. I'm assuming this would be, you'd get to like Jem's point, you would check, well, do you have adipose tissue differences in those two sites? I'm assuming you probably very minimal. I don't think that that's a factor.
Mhm.
It's probably is something that your right and left leg are developed somewhat differently.
Mhm.
So
yeah, I've got some. That's still an unresolved situation as to why this happened and what can exactly be done to rectify it if it needs rectifying. That's always as well a question, but
yeah.
I think it's worth noting the differences. In here, we got the same. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So I mean, and to like these flow limitation points, which is what Jem does, right? Before I would always say, well, this is something to do, something that's happening at like the diffusion level in the muscle, right?
Mhm.
That the difference right and left, and not this delivery. But it could also be because if you get athletes, you do get athletes that show, well, the issue is happening at the supply kind of like level, and it's creating a right and left difference, for example, like kinking of. So I mean, that might be something that could be happening with you. I don't know, and maybe that's causing the issue, and it's not actually my initial interpretation of it being happening at the muscular level. I mean, that might not be the case. So
yeah, still to look into. So here we have the hypoxic condition for both legs again. So blue is right leg and pink is left leg. An interesting thing that right away jumps out at me. First of all, obviously the trends are slightly different, where before we had a positive trend in the moderate domain on the right leg, and now it's pretty much flat. Well, the pink is pulling down, and then in the heavy now both start to pull down, at least towards the end. And there's an inversion between the two signals in the severe intensity domain. And that's interesting for me because we're going to see that again in the repeat sprints after, spoiler alert. So maybe if we look at those differences here, and maybe is it better if I put them like this? What, same leg, hypoxic, normoxic, or what do you prefer, doing this one first?
Well, yeah, let's look at this one. So the inversion that you in the severe, like for me, that's like, nah. Like, I don't know if it's like that big. I mean, they both basically like really bottom out at like what would be indicated as the almost lowest possible percent by the
Mhm.
Moxy algorithm, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know if I would be super hard on like you have an inversion of the signal. But
Okay.
I would look at more like in the severe, in both cases, they seem to both reach some kind of lower limit of the Moxy algorithm to identify that percent saturation. And it's saying, well, you're at 0.
Mhm.
It's pretty close to that. Whereas the other, what is more interesting for me is that in the heavy, you kind of have a pretty similar response. You have the separation, which is consistent. Maybe it gets a little bit bigger, faster,
Mhm.
and they both trend down at the end. That's expected with hypoxia. I would expect that more to happen if you're maintaining. This is the constant work rate, but you're taking oxygen away.
Mhm.
But it's funny that, or interesting, funny is the weird, interesting that in the moderate you get this separation much more clear, right, than you
Yeah.
do in the other one. The other one, it's not really a separation, but here when you start limiting oxygen, it's looking more like the heavy, right? You've like shifted
Yes.
everything over a little,
Exactly. Yeah.
resulting probably from this challenge to oxygen availability
Mhm.
at the low level.
That makes sense.
I think that's pretty. I don't know what you think about that. If I am. So the inversion thing, I don't know. I don't know if that inversion is actually there or not. That's
Yeah,
would be to that point.
I look forward to your commentary on the repeat sprint data, because it looks very much the same. So here, if we look at
Okay.
right leg only, normoxia and hypoxia. So if we were to look at the trends, we could definitely see a difference in the, I guess, a slight difference in the moderate, but it does pull down in absolute numbers, and then the slope would change as well if we were to plot that over maybe the last 3 minutes of each 4-minute stage. And same in the heavy, and then like you said, in the severe, the plateau is reached. It's just that it's a lower plateau in hypoxia, but ultimately that's not a huge difference between the two curves there.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are interesting here. Obviously you get this general decrease, which is expected, and you get this negative slopes happening earlier in hypoxia. which I would also expect, because just basically your overall, say, maximum exercise performance will be decreased in hypoxia. So everything kind of shifts down, which is, by the way, everything we're saying is essentially the opposite if you were due to hyperoxic in most cases. Everything shifts in the other direction.
Yeah.
These are some of those discussions by like,
did you see some of that data with the Moxy as well? Just seeing the comparing, slopes and trends in hyperoxia. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's like the opposite, and this goes into like a lot of these VO2 limitations discussion, and a lot of that is or a major key or discussion point is that well, you can totally manipulate this by going hyper or hypoxic, right? You can manipulate this around. So obviously this oxygen becomes the oxygen availability from the environment becomes a major factor in maximal oxygen uptake and in performance as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We can, that's a whole rabbit hole to go down there, which is interesting. Let's get back to this data. So that the trends are kind of what I would expect. What's interesting is in the recovery, right? You get a faster recovery happening in the normoxic. The hyperoxic has a slower slope to get back up. Basically, it takes the entire recovery. It's recovering up the entire time, right? And then it kind of gets back to the same level as the normoxic, which I would also expect from my data. It just takes it's way lower. It takes way longer to get there. Yeah. And I would say the slope is also less steep, but I haven't calculated this, but by eye, I would say there's some separation in that. I think in your sprint data, that's a little clearer.
That is clear than here. Over there. But, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So we'll look at that. We'll look at that after.
Those are calves. This is right calf, normoxic, hypoxic. So not a lot of separation in the first two stages, but definitely a huge difference in the severe domain here.
Yeah, there's actually a paper on this where they look at effect of hypoxia on VL. I think vastus lateralis in the calf as well.
Okay.
I think, yeah. So it's a quad and it's upper and lower leg. And they actually they show that you have a bigger hypoxic response in the upper leg than the lower leg. I don't know if this has to do with, when we're talking about near signal, I don't know if this has to do with activation of the muscles. I think it was running in that test, which would be an important thing to know now. I'm going to say it was running, which might then have to do with general muscle activation during exercise that results in that. It might also have to do with basically muscle properties of the calf or the quad that results in that. These what's more of a primary mover type thing. But this seems to fit at least that experimental data as well. Yeah, but it's interesting that the response isn't quite as severe, right?
No, it's definitely not. This is the other calf on the left hand side, and that's the left bicep, which I always find fascinating looking at non-involved muscles, especially in the severe intensity domain, because it usually shows an interesting picture. Here, not so much if we look at the light green, which is normoxic condition. It does pull lower than the other ones, but it doesn't have a downward trend. I don't know if it's because the intensity is not high enough. 300 watts is about, depending on what method I take to calculate that second threshold, it's going to be between 15 and 35 watts up above my second threshold. So it's not super high intensity, and I've seen biceps pull down really low if I'm actually doing a max effort in the severe intensity domain, whether it's on a 12-minute or a 3-minute all-out test. But here it doesn't show so much until you put me in hypoxia, and then you clearly see the bicep from minute 3 to 4, so minute 13 to 14. That's clearly there's the systemic homeostasis has been disrupted, as I would maybe say.
Yeah. So this is pretty interesting too. Also, it seems like the recovery is happening basically at the end of recovery. So like you start up again, right? Yeah. So basically with an increase in cardiac or cardiopulmonary function, then you get this uptick again. with you probably with the decrease in cardiopulmonary function over the rest periods, you get an increase in oxygenation of the lower body, but not as much in the upper body, not until you actually increase cardiopulmonary work again with exercise, which is interesting. So I kind of get this similar response too in cycling and less so in running when we've done it in altitude. Where you seem to not have such a big effect until you basically go all out.
Yeah.
On the upper body. I don't know, but with running, it's a little bit opposite. You have quicker an effect on the upper body. So it might have to do with whole muscle mass involved.
Possibly. Yeah.
For the exercise you're looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always, I always see, like you said, those bumps usually happen after the work has started up again, when you look at a non-evolved muscle.
Yeah.
And like you said, yeah, you gotta be working pretty hard for that to go down. Even in normoxic conditions, you gotta be working hard. You gotta be well into the severe domain and then sustain that for some period of time to see anything. So that was the bicep. I think that was the last one on the domains. Did you want to add anything on the intensity domains and what we looked at before we look at the sprint data?
Let's go to the sprint data and we'll see how much time we got.
All right. So sprint interval training
flying around.
We can't see it on your screen.
So
it's just it's only bothering you, Andri.
Okay, that's good.
No, I hope you get it, by the way. So 20 seconds all out and 40-second passive rest. I just set the bike's resistance to what I knew would allow me to express maximal power and usually be between 120 and 130 RPMs. So that's how I set the resistance on the bike erg I was using. And like I said, I had previous data from this. So the comparison is not on the same day, but it's on the exact same effort. So first is both normoxic, left and right. So right is blue and left is purple, I believe. So I guess maybe a little bit of separation here on the minimum value and slightly on the slope as well. Would you note any notable differences between the two curves here?
So this is the same way around it. It's for the constant load, right? Left was lower, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this looks like something we've done with like tons of hockey players data like this.
Yeah.
And there's some studies on basically delayed recovery, right? You stop and how long does it take for you to even get a response upwards? And it's one study I'm citing now, they look at that basically the muscle with the higher oxidative capacity, so the muscles that are using oxygen better, they have this longer delay.
Okay.
Right. So this would imply that maybe your left leg, in this idea of, well, is the difference happening at the muscular level, is that your left leg is actually consuming oxygen better, and that's resulting in this delayed uptick. Now there's always confounding factors here that if you limit, I think we'll see this in the hypoxic data we're about to find out. If you limit oxygen supply, you also can generate this delay. So it's like you often need some other information to generate this, but that's interesting.
Would you
and in our hockey players, the players with the longer these delays were also generally the players that correlated with higher sprint speeds.
Yeah, just like you would, I guess, same idea as you would see a bigger percent speed decrement in people that sprint faster on a repeat sprint test, for example, for a soccer player. So the guy or the gal with the highest top speed is usually going to lose the most speed from set to set, because maybe there's a higher general cost to their effort, or they just go faster, and so each effort costs more than somebody who would go, not as fast, but could maintain their top speed a little bit better across time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what you were saying before is interesting in the sense that, well, because could we then say that this type of effort, an all-out effort, is obviously going to be biased towards oxygen utilization, and then the lower intensity ones that we saw before, moderate, heavy, maybe even severe, are more biased towards the delivery side of the oxygen continuum. And the two data sets would not be contradicting themselves in the sense that this is lower because it has better utilization and the other one is lower because it has worse delivery. But then is it the same thing, or can we parse out the two?
So just, do you mean lower in the sense of the absolute SMO2 is lower in your sprints than in your constant work?
Or I guess that the left leg is lower on the sprints, but we assign that to potentially better utilization and that delayed slope of recovery. But then when we looked at the moderate, heavy, severe data, it was also lower, but for a different reason. If we compare left to right.
I don't know if it's lower for different reasons. I don't know if they're both lower, which shows consistency.
Yes.
I don't know why. But what is interesting is that you get, if we're going to take, if I go back to your normoxic data, I think you get to like 15% down to 15%.
Yeah.
Something like that. 10.
I'm at 10.
Yeah, 10. Okay. So there's not that big of a difference. You get a little bit lower. Now, if that's significantly lower or not, I don't know. But if you go to the normoxic, you get more down to what your sprint is. Yeah. I mean, if you go to the hypoxic, right, you get more down to what your sprint looks like.
Yeah.
So there's like this, potentially this gap. And so it's like an extraction gap that you have that's happening under your normoxic constant load versus your hypoxic or your sprint. There's like a little bit of this extraction gap.
Yeah.
That probably has to do with utilization versus supply available at the time that's happening. So it's most likely this supply, like you're not getting the oxygen in, and extraction is really high. So it's using this oxygen extraction reserve. Right. And there's literature talks about this a little bit. There's a couple that use NIRS and look at this and say, well, there's this extraction reserve, like you're doing VO2 efforts or super VO2 efforts, and you don't get it down as low as if you are doing isometric contractions or if you're doing occlusions. You can get NIRS signals lower. Like, why can't you get it down that far? So there's some extraction reserves there, and I don't know why that happens, but I mean, generally speaking, there is an extraction reserve available. So if you go away from NIRS and you just go to like venous blood blood is never zero oxygen. You always have oxygen available to you. This is another one of those VO2 limitation arguments. It's like, well, there's always still oxygen happening. You can manipulate VO2 and performance by giving oxygen, taking it away, but at the same time, there's also always oxygen left in the venous system. And these are like these two things talking about, well, like what's limiting VO2. And there is always some kind of reserve, and this might have to do something to do with just laws of diffusion happening at the muscular level, because you have these competing elements that happening in diffusion. You're bringing oxygen in convectively, so you're bringing it in via circulation, and in order for you to get oxygen off of the blood into the muscle, you need to have a pressure gradient, right? It needs to go from high pressure to low pressure. So you want you want lots of oxygen happening at in the blood to get it off and you want low pressure in the muscle, right? So you have this big gradient. But at the same time, within the muscle, you need to somehow move the oxygen that you're getting in, and you need to diffuse it to be able to use it within the muscle. And that is at competition, because if you have a really low pressure happening around in the muscle, it's harder to get it into the mitochondria as well. But if you have a high pressure, then you're not getting any in from the blood. And so there's these Wagner diagrams that show that competition nicely. That basically, if to get a high convective, so a high VO2 based on circulation, that is at odds with getting a high VO2 from diffusion that's happening in the muscle. And VO2 basically becomes the intersect of those points.
Yes.
Visually,
Yeah,
easily on the, if you have a graph, they generate like an X. And the point of the intersect is VO2 because they're at competition with each other. Now it's not exactly an X. The supply one, the convective one makes like a sigmoid kind of pattern. That doesn't matter. The point is there's competition. There's physiological diffusion laws that are like competing against each other, and you're trying to optimize that.
Yeah.
I mean, way off on a different thing there,
but that was
just
that
to
was
understand
good. That was interesting. Yeah, no, that I think it's good to know those things, looking at those different data sets, because it maybe helps us understand what we can't understand everything. If we go to hypoxia now.
Yeah, so maybe one more point to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
That whole relationship is then also capped off by just if your mitochondria can even use it. So you can diffuse it, it works, you optimize it, but if your mitochondria can't use it, then it's like a cap on all of that.
Yeah.
But that cap, for example, in elite athletes, that's generally not a cap. Whereas untrained people, that is more potentially a cap that's happening. So
interesting. So now hypoxia and the inversion happens again.
Yeah.
So talk us through it, because I don't know why it's happening.
Yeah. I don't know why. I would just weasel my way out of the question and say, I don't see an inversion. It's basically just the same. Maybe the inversion is more that they're closer than before. You know, they kind of normalize themselves. You know, the gap isn't there anymore. Let's say that.
Okay.
Which goes in a little bit into your point of inversion. I don't know exactly why that's happening, but I think generally, so wait, go back to the other one quickly.
I can put them side to side.
Yeah, go back. Yeah, so yeah. Oh, there you go. That's
right and right.
Yeah. So, so if you go back, it's more like the inversion happens more that the right leg, which was higher, comes down to the left leg. That's what I see. If you put left and right for hypoxia next to each other, the one back, they merge closer together. Now, okay, the blue drops a little bit below the purple, but essentially they come closer together. And I would argue that this is probably just happening is that because you've limited oxygen supply, the extraction rate relatively goes up to what is maximally possible, let's say. And then they both just find a space together. This is what's possible.
Okay.
Whereas, yeah, that's what I would say. But I don't know exactly why that's happening. So,
and yeah, another thing that I note here, this is right leg normoxic in blue and hypoxic in purple, is that obviously you don't reach the same percentage of SMO2 max in terms of maximal saturation. You can see that I'm pretty much stuck at 60% here, where usually I can go towards 80 within 40 seconds.
Yeah, so definitely there's a slow recovery rate. It's very clear here, a lot clearer here than in the constant load. But in the constant load, if you remember, the break that you had between heavy and severe resulted in an equal high oxygen saturation in normoxia and hypoxia.
Yeah.
That might just be a result of the length of the break. So if you were to give a longer break here, it might come up, because basically it's kind of recovering the entire time.
Yes.
Actually, in both cases, but
yeah,
it just comes up and up and up and up and up. So it's possible that I would assume that actually the hypoxic one would trend up more if you give more of a break.
Yeah, if you look at
what the constant data you have, it shows.
And I don't remember what I did at minute 3, but it seems to plateau in both legs around that 60, right? And that's right and that's left. And so obviously I only have from 3 minutes to 3 minutes 15 here. I didn't collect farther after that because I needed to get out of the chamber because it was uncomfortable. But yeah, it does seem like there's a 20% difference, both during and then
so
after.
this kind of flattening of the Yeah, the flattening the plateau that you see at the top, you see them both. The one might be an actual plateau because you're getting up to 80%. Whereas under hypoxia, there is something that once you start prepping, like you get these funny things when you start prepping for exercises, that you get changes in the near signal. I don't know if you've seen that too. Like you're like, hey, you get ready for it. So what's interesting is if you repeat this, I guess you can't repeat it in hypoxic, you don't have a chamber. But if you were just like stay cool, like not, oh, I'm ramping up, I got to start my next, because I mean, this break is 40 seconds. So when you say the plateau is starting, we're talking like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I'm ready to go again. But if you're just like cool and sitting, if it would really plateau out there again, it would,
Good question. Good question. Unanswered so far. That's an interesting one for me, the bicep.
Yeah, so I really like this data, and it's because I get to tell a cool story. You've probably heard it a bunch of times, but so like early on, I think this was May 2014. So like kind of beginning of Moxy. Moxy went to Fort Bragg, and we did repeat Wingates with Marines. Marines are crazy because they just do what they're told until they die. It's pretty impressive. So they had to do these repeat Wingates. Anyone notices Wingate, doing one Wingate's not a lot of fun. And then if they just keep doing what, basically the commander's like, yeah, they'll do Wingates. And we're like, well, let's do a couple. And he's like, well, how many do you want them to do? And I was like, my God. So basically like Wingate got off. And we're like, okay, let's do another one. Marine, lying on the ground, toasted, gets up, gets back on. Wingate drops down again. Commander's like, another one, jumps back up, gets on his Wingate, destroys himself. I was very impressed. And we had all these Moxys on him, and we had Moxys on the lower body and the upper body. And what we were doing is we said, well, let's do every repeated Wingate at the time when the lower body, so the quad muscles, when they're back up to where it was before. That's when we were starting the next Wingate. And essentially the signal that we got in the upper body was what you see here. Is that with every sprint, you had some recovery happening in the recovery time, but never as high. And it just kept getting lower and lower and lower. This is actually in a bunch of the repeated hockey sprints. You get data like this too. I have data like this with soccer players and repeat sprints as well. And some field hockey players as well. And so this is nice data because you have it with the normoxic, which is what I would expect, but you have it even severe in hypoxic, down to essentially nothing. And for me, this does show an overall inability to supply or to resupply oxygen quickly enough. Or maybe, and this idea is that maybe it's not the resupplying of oxygen, but the resupplying of energy in the break, which uses oxygen. This is why these oxygen levels remain depleted, right? This is like would be the old idea of like oxygen debt, right? You have to repay the used oxygen, which to a certain extent is obviously true and happening. I don't like the word debt. I don't think it's used so much more either because it makes it sound like you're negative, which you're obviously not, because you'd be in trouble. It's more like you used up your debt. Yeah. So, so this is what I expect. I would expect it to be severe in hypoxia, which it also is. We've talked about this somehow showing this inability to resupply energy. And what's interesting to this is what we also thought with hockey players is, well, what does this mean for repeated sprint efforts in athletic disciplines that require upper lower body coordination and upper lower body effort? So I don't know if you've done this, but if you do sprints, max effort sprints, and you try to get people then to do chin-ups, it's tough, right?
Yeah,
so
there probably isn't much
left.
left. Yeah, there's not much left from at a systemic level, and so no matter what you're trying to use after, then there's nothing there.
Exactly. And you also see, for example, studies that show lower body resistance training has positive effects on upper body mass and strength with no upper body work. So there's some systemic metabolic response happening that has overall positive effects. That's why if you're a gym rat, you make sure you don't skip leg day, basically.
That's a good one to remember. I was gonna say something on the upper body. Oh yeah, I was gonna say Andrew Usher. I know that when he tests his fighters, he tests them on upper body, lower body wind gate protocols, and so that's obviously not very fun, but that's essentially what he does. So he does wind gate lower body. I think then it's 1 minute rest, and then wind gate upper body, and then they repeat it a second time with his boxers. I believe that's it's close to the protocol that he's using. So I'd be interested to see what he sees on that upper or lower on those hard efforts too.
So he does them separated. It's like just lower body wind gate, just upper body wind gate, and no lower upper, because you could do, air bike, you could do upper lower body together.
Yeah, no, it's separate. So wind gate on a bike,
okay.
on a load bike, and then they have the I don't know what it's called, the load bike version for the upper body, and they're able to do both.
So you get, at least from data that I have on this, it's much harder to get a big response on lower body muscles from upper body muscles. It's just probably muscle mass mismatch. But if you have well-trained upper bodies, you do get a response in the lower body if the upper body mass is pretty big, right? If you get back, shoulders, arms involved, that does seem to happen as well. It's a lot easier to get it done with the lower body. I mean, it's unavoidable, basically.
Yeah, because you have enough, like you said, you have enough working, and you can produce enough work that it's going to kind of pull in the lower body or the whole organism as at once, I guess. Are there any, except for observational purposes, is there any practical considerations we can draw from this graph that we're looking at of the non-evolved muscles and their behavior in all-out efforts? Is that something that we can use to maybe auto-regulate recoveries on such efforts? Is it worth doing that? Is there any other kind of practical application that we can use?
So this is speculation, somewhat anecdotal. If you're doing tasks that require coordination and effort in the upper body, you may be better off looking recovery in the non-involved or the upper body muscle. If it's going to be, if you know that's going to be, or maybe you dictate perform a recovery based on that, if it's needed. There is not everyone has a severe bicep response. Some people have more severe and less severe, even during max efforts. That might have something to do with these VO2 limitation ideas, that you need to have the more severe your oxygen supply mismatch is, that you're going to get a strong response in these, let's say, non-involved or less involved or auxiliary involved muscles. So maybe it helps you discern that response a little bit more.
Okay. Would you go?
Those were.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yep. No. What were you gonna say?
Would you go as far as to say that might have assessment value in terms of, because again, like even on a longer step test, like I do the 4-1, I do see people at the end that are able to desaturate on the shoulder or the forearm, whichever one I use for, depending on the modality, but then there's others that don't. So if someone has no ability to desaturate on a non-involved muscle at a higher, they're obviously in the severe intensity domain, they're usually at, I don't know, 110% of their threshold, or a little bit above that when they end the test. So does that tell me anything about the person? Do they need to do more sprint interval training if they're not able to essentially extract enough at a given intensity relative to the systemic response? Is that a line of thinking that might be interesting to you?
So in data that I have, essentially all data that I'm drawing up right now is, if you have people who get really strong desaturations and plateau down really low, they're going to have a response in like the upper body if we take cycling, for example. And there's actually some publications on this, and it matches data that I have, is that you get the upper body response usually happening around threshold 2, which would be where you're plateauing in your lower body. So this idea that you could also, I mean, this kind of matches Brett Kirby's data too. It's something like critical power happening, and you can see it in your forearm as well. So this all somewhat lines up, and there's always some variations here, but it seems somewhat line up. But people who don't actually reach that kind of plateau at the bottom and tend to have elevated muscle oxygenation levels anyways, they often show a blunted or no response in these non-involved muscles, to your point that it becomes like an additional tool to help you identify potentially, well, oxygen availability seems to be given. It's more of a problem maybe at the local level, right? Which is going to be with a bunch of different factors that are involved. So, I mean, this can be mitochondrial function involved. We talked about mitochondria being this cap potentially. So that can be, but it can also be just straight up things like capillary density. Like, are you you have oxygen, but are you getting the diffusion gradients that you need to get the oxygen that's even around back into where it needs to go in the muscle? So there's different factors there, but yeah. And then to the practicality of that, like how we're going to apply that to training, you would do something that is more about local muscle stimulation, but a bunch of that is also just volume. I mean, you can just do lots of training, and that's going to generate, I mean, that's, but if you don't have that much time and time efficiency, generally speaking, it would appear that if you do sprint intervals, it seems to be more effective in getting those local adaptations done.
Okay. Yeah.
Those would be my
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like the fact that, looking at that non-involved muscle response might give us some information as to the abilities of the person to really pull everything that's there to a large extent, and maybe, like you said, orient the training prescription for that person for the at least sometime in the future. So that's good to know. I think I'm at the end of the data set. So I appreciate you taking the time to come and comment with me on those different data points. Is there, maybe if you could put a call out there to Moxy users and enthusiasts or other physiology enthusiasts, what other type of comparisons or data would you like to see collected by people that have the means to do so, and why?
Yeah, I mean, this was really good. It'd be good to get this. So one of the things that I would like is this. I mean, there's lots of studies out on this. I haven't seen anything with the Moxy, but this difference between hypobaric and normal baric hypoxia,
right?
Because there seems to be an effect difference there, and it seems to be regulated by potentially. So a lot of the differences are the same regardless of how you do it. So a lot of the cardiopulmonary responses seem to be the same, or like your arterial saturation seems to be the same. So you're like, wow, it's the same. But you get, for example, like nitric oxide responses are different, which is interesting. So there's a Swiss group that actually did a study on that, where the bioavailability of nitric oxide decreased in hypobaric, which would be like natural altitude, but not in let's say artificial normal baric altitude. So I think those could be interesting, and getting the Moxy on board with that, I think will be pretty interesting. Another thing that I've done, but it's super anecdotal, is that basically at rest, the amount of change I have in my arterial saturation at rest is the amount of change that I have in my Moxy signal. So if I'm at 90% SpO2 at altitude, or 92%, and so I'm down 5, 6, 7, 8%, my muscles, I'm down 5, 6, 7, 8%. And I'm wondering if that actually holds up across people, or if that just happens is a happenstance with me. I think that would be pretty interesting, but you have to specifically use the Moxy for that. I mean, you could try it with other, but it'd be have to be something percent based, so not relative values of hemoglobin. of
Okay.
deoxyhemoglobin, which is used in a lot of the studies. So I think that would be pretty interesting as well.
Okay. Well, for those who are out there with Moxys and with access to altitude chambers and real altitude, I guess that's the next thing to do then.
Hey, Sean, I got one more comment
Yeah.
because this is pretty interesting, especially because you're under the hood. I'm not sure how many of you've done, but the first thing you did was with GEM, right?
Yes, I think this is number 2.
Okay, well then, see, I can follow up, right, and keep this going. So you guys did the SMO2 profiles. And you see, well, there's these 2 profiles, this kind of linear down response to a plateau, and you get this kind of curvilinear response. There's actually, I've seen this, again, anecdotally, but there's actually a paper published on this as well, which always feels good when other people kind of confirm what I'm seeing. And if you take you take these 2 profiles and you do hypoxia on one or the other, is that you get a bigger reduction in performance in the athletes. So the athletes that show the linear down to plateau generally have higher performance outputs. So I don't know if you see this, I see this, and this group also documented that. But they're also the ones that have the higher reduction in performance in hypoxia than the other group.
Okay.
So the idea being fits this idea that if you have this linear down and a plateau, you've maximized something like oxygen extraction. It's a supply problem. So if you make the supply problem even worse by being in a hypoxic environment, you drastically decrease your performance. Whereas this curvilinear pattern where you don't reach this extraction plateau, let's say, creating more of a supply problem isn't going to have as big an effect. It still does, but it's not going to be as big because you weren't hitting that wall as hard as the other ones were. So I think that's just this segment to your segment of GEM about these nearest profiles and hypoxia. I think that's an interesting thing for people to consider. I think it's interesting.
Which does circle back to the delivery versus utilization limitation within athletes, somewhat.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's my final comment. I just thought to bridge the 2 under the hood.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you making the link. So for everybody watching, go check out Under the Hood episode 1 with Jem Arnold, where we talk about different Moxy profiles depending on different factors. Yeah, Andri, that was fun. And I guess next time I have more data, we'll have to do it again.
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's fun. Sorry for the delay on getting this going.
No worries at all. It was fun. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Okay, thanks. Bye.